Here we go. All right. Last year, I found myself sitting backstage at a comedy club here in San Diego. I was opening all weekend for Norm Macdonald, and once he finished his set, it was my job to go up and close out the night. If you had told me at 14 that this was something I'd be doing one day, I would have probably been legitimately hurt by the intricacy and personalization of your joke. You see, I was and am a comedy nerd. I was a comedy nerd before it was cool to be an anything nerd. Before Comic-Con was a hub of pop culture, and when the word nerd meant more Kimmy Gibbler and less Zooey Deschanel. Back when someone holding a banana like a gun was still considered edgy. We didn't have Netflix or YouTube, hell, we didn't have the internet. I had to tape my favorite shows, or sneak down the stairs when my mom was asleep to watch Conan and Letterman. I'd pray she wouldn't wake up when I laughed at Triumph the Insult Comic Dog or Rupert G. always on the verge of getting knocked out. Amongst my small group of friends, you had to know what happened on last night's talk shows. And while regaling Andy Richter getting murdered, you'd see the cool kids walk by with Danielle Kinney and know your path would be a lonely one. That was fine. Being uncool meant I could focus a lot more time on comedy, and I knew everything there was to know about it. From Buster Keaton to Mr. Show with Bob and David, this was my world. When I started primarily doing stand-up in 2010, I knew exactly what I wanted to do and how to accomplish it. Of course, just like everybody, I had my struggles from the beginning. Getting on stage all alone and trying to make a room full of people who've already made 3 assumptions about you before you said a word laugh is horrific. But I persevered, moved up the ranks, worked hard, and I quickly started performing with the people I'd idolized growing up, like Dave Attell, Maria Bamford, and Louis C.K. Adding Norm to that list was like performing with the vice president of stand-up. He's one of the most brilliant and respected performers in the world of comedy. I started as a sketch comedian because of my love for Saturday Night Live, having come of age during Norm's tenure on Weekend Update. Now getting the chance to hang out with him, drink coffee, and talk about the history of comedy was incredible. You see, these are the things I reflect on backstage, while outside drunks are heckling and eating chicken strips. A backstage for comics is not like a backstage for musicians. There are rarely drugs. There's half-eaten nachos everywhere, and it's quiet. It's kind of our escape from everything. Despite what you might think, stand-up is a lonely job. It requires the participation of dozens and sometimes hundreds of people, but what we put ourselves through to get one laugh takes a toll. You need backstage to reflect and adjust. We're a lonely breed who craves attention. We're idiots. Norm got his light, letting me know he was about to wrap up, and suddenly the club manager bursts in and says 5 words I'll never forget as long as I live. Steve Martin just walked in. I laughed it off as some sort of weird joke, but then he followed it with, Steve Martin just walked in, and Paul Simon is parking the car. This second sentence somehow made this incredibly unlikely story much more likely. Paul Simon and Steve Martin were best friends. They both had strong SNL ties, and of course Norm was an SNL legend, so wait a minute, Steve Martin is here? The manager assures me this isn't a joke, and before I have time to react, I hear Norm say goodnight, so I hustle out on stage to say my goodbyes and my drive safes, and I immediately start looking for Steve Martin and Paul Simon. The lights come up, and sure enough, there they are, sitting in the very back. These days, it's almost impossible to tell someone that someone is the greatest, or that something is literally the best ever, because it's such a saturated proclamation. However, what I'm about to tell you contains no use of hyperbole and has no measure of exaggeration within. Steve Martin is the reason I started performing on stage. He was the sole motivation that drove me to be in front of someone else and make him or her smile. When I was 10 years old, I saw Three Amigos and peed my pants. When I was 12, I saw LA Story, and it blew my mind that someone could write, star, and direct in a film all at once. When I was 14, I saw The Jerk, and for the first time ever understood what I wanted to do with my life. If Norm was the vice president of stand-up, then Steve Martin was Abraham freaking Lincoln, the man who changed the game and created a shift in everything that followed. If I was ever seriously dating a girl, she was required to watch My Blue Heaven, and if she didn't laugh at least once, she was taken out of consideration as a life partner. That's not a joke. To say Steve Martin influenced everything I do would almost be a disservice to Steve Martin, but it's true. The thought that I would one day meet him, let alone be in the same room as him, never even crossed my mind. I mean, for God's sakes, his best friend is believed by many to be the greatest living American songwriter, and they were now 100 feet away from me. As I made the short trip from the stage to backstage, I'm thinking, this is going to be awesome. Norm and Steve have to be buddies. I mean, why else would he be here? I knew that Steve Martin had written a new musical with Edie Brickell and that just opened at the Oak Globe, so the fact that they were in the same city made sense. But why on earth would he drive downtown to sit in a little club and watch stand-up if he didn't know Norm? In my head, Steve Martin will come backstage, he and Norm will decide to go grab some drinks, and we'll all be invited. This will be the greatest night of my life. Well, the night of my daughter's birth, then this. Well, my daughter's birth, first time I touched a boob in 7th grade, then this. When I finally get backstage, Norm is pacing and has no idea why Steve Martin is here. I say, probably to see you, and he kind of chuckles. I then offer to go get him, to which Norm says, yeah, go get Steve and tell him I want to say hi. As I walk to the back of the club, it sinks in that Norm MacDonald just asked me to go get Steve Martin and bring him backstage. I was suddenly in a parallel universe. Nothing mattered anymore. Everyone looked like manatees. And I was sweating. I approached. Steve Martin sat drinking a glass of wine, a fedora tilted forward just a tad, and a suit jacket that probably cost more than my car. I didn't know what to say. You see, I've always avoided meeting my heroes because, one, I want them to be how they are in my head, and that's impossible. I've spent a lifetime collecting thoughts and perceptions of just what it would be like to hang out with Steve Martin. In my mind, he was the thoughtful, considerate dad from Parenthood, or the witty, charming hero in Roxanne. Problem is, what if he's a jerk, a real one? It's a coin flip, and I never wanted to make it. 2, I never know what to say. What can you say to somebody who meant everything to you? Someone who shaped your sensibilities and timing? Thank you? That seems appropriate. But here I actually had something to say, a clear objective, get him backstage. So I started with, excuse me, Mr. Martin, Norm would love if you came backstage so he could say hello. He turned to me and said, oh yeah, we're not going to do that. I froze. Did I say something I didn't think I said? Was that whole manatee thing out loud? Did Norm set me up? Do these two hate each other? Should I die? He broke the silence. I'm kidding. Let's go. Fucking genius. I walked Steve Martin, Paul Simon, Edie Brickell, and a couple other people backstage. When we all got in the room, I texted my wife. She's an enormous Paul Simon fan. In fact, our cat is named Simon after Paul Simon. There was a Garfunkel, but he died. She was flipping out. She couldn't believe what was happening, and honestly, neither could I. I just kept staring at Steve Martin. He was so relaxed, so cool, so confident. He knew he was the most important guy in the room, and it meant nothing to him. This is a guy who had reached the finish line in a field of entertainment that doesn't have one. He began introducing himself, as if we needed the introductions, but he carried on nonetheless. When he got to me, a guy standing next to me blurted out, hey, Dallas is really funny. I was laughing the whole time. The guy was Steve Martin's nephew. So Steve replied with, oh, why don't you tell us a joke then? I felt like I had just ridden every roller coaster at the same time. Don't you hate it when people ask you to do that, Steve said. I haven't told a joke in 30 years, and people still ask me all the time. The room felt the relief of 1,000 farts. And we moved on. Then Steve looked at Norm, and I thought, here it comes. We're all going out and becoming best friends. There was a short pause, and Norm asked, what are you doing in San Diego? Steve mentioned he was in town for the new musical he wrote. Then there was another pause, much longer this time, and Norm asked, how do you write a musical? Oh, God. Norm was geeking out. He was just as nervous and in love as we were. It was over. We weren't going out. We weren't becoming friends. And from the conversation that began to unravel, it seems like Norm and Steve didn't even know each other. Norm's assistant mercifully broke up the conversation with, let's all get a picture, to which Norm yelled, God, yes. I asked Norm's assistant if she could take one with my phone, and she obliged. When I handed my phone over, Steve Martin made fun of how old it was, and after a photo was taken, he asked to see it. The picture was awful. It was grainy and dark, and Steve yells out, that's a terrible picture. How old is this iPhone? Jeez. Let's take another one, and this time, Paul, you get in. You know, Paul Simon, because he was just standing there. Everyone agreed this was a great idea, except for Paul Simon. The only way he could have expressed how much he didn't want to be in this picture more was if he yelled, no, and ran out of the room. However, Steve convinced him, and he certainly looks excited. Then Steve took my phone and asked, "What's wrong with it?" I told him it was old and the camera sucked, and he started just taking pictures of things. Then he looked at the pictures, spit on the back of the phone, rubbed it on his leg, and said, "Hey, let's take one of those selfies," to which I said, "Of course we should do that." So we did. Then Steve just started talking about stand-up. He began talking about old times and jokes he'd written and new jokes he'd write, and I finally understood what it meant to feel. He began telling this long story about a road gig that he had back in the late 70s. Everyone's ears were glued, and we couldn't wait for this story to pay off with some amazing joke, but it didn't. He just ended the story. Everyone stood there in silence, and Steve said, "That's it. That's the story. Sorry, I thought I mentioned I don't tell jokes anymore." And everyone howled. He was the master of the room. Things started to calm down, and it was clear they were heading out, so I turned to Paul Simon. "Mr. Simon, you have no idea how big a fan my wife is of your music. Of course, I think you're amazing, but she is a big, big fan." He said, "Thank you," and I, for some reason, felt like he didn't understand what I was trying to tell him. So I said, "Hey, we have a cat, and it's named Simon after you. We used to have a Garfunkel, but he died." Paul Simon looked at me blankly for about 2 solid seconds. Then he turned and walked away. I sank inward. And I turned just in time to catch Steve Martin walking out. So naturally, I walked him to the elevator. On the way there, I kept thinking about what had just happened. That he came backstage and hung out. It wasn't a meet and greet. It wasn't an appearance. It was a hangout. He wanted to talk comedy with comedians and made Paul Simon wait around while he did it. This is something comics do all the time. It's almost exhausting. We love to sit around and talk comedy and jokes and who's good right now and who's hack, and we can do it for hours. It's why my wife stopped coming to shows years ago. And here is Steve Martin still itching for that hang time that for some reason we all crave, the togetherness we find in our loneliness. The bond we share of highs and lows that's sacred only to us, makes sense only to us. It's a trust we have in each other and ourselves. Knowing that a guy who's reached the highest level of my business, clearly still believing in that bond, is something that reassured me of how idiotic and important what we do is. I kept thinking, this is my chance. I'm going to ask him for a job or to go to lunch or something. I couldn't just let him walk away. No one had ever meant more to me in the history of things. We got to the elevator. He turned back and he said, "Very nice to meet you." I replied with my big chance statement that was going to change it all. "Thank you." He smiled and said, "No, thank you." As if on cue, the elevator doors closed and left just enough time for me to see the annoyed look on Paul Simon's face. You're welcome.
That was Dallas McLaughlin.